Okay. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at least in Sweden. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Scope 3 webinar, where we will be digging into actionable strategies to measure and minimize your carbon footprint in food procurement. But firstly, let's introduce ourselves. So we at Klimato are a digital solution to measure mostly Scope 3 emissions. My name is Rebecca, and I work in our customer success team at Klimato. And I'm here together with our brilliant science expert, Joya.
Hi, everyone, to the webinar.
So for this webinar, we will be your hosts, and I will be taking kind of the customer point of view, asking all those questions that our customers usually are asking us, while Joya is going more in depth, giving explanations into the science, the data behind everything. A few housewarming rules before we get started. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded, so if any of your colleagues might miss this, no worries at all. We will follow up with a link after the webinar as well. And if you won't ask any questions during the webinar, you're more than welcome. If you go to the bottom right-hand corner, there's a Q&A button where you can ask questions. You can do that anonymously if you want to. We will actually be hiding the questions when we're speaking, just to not be disturbed, but we'll be choosing a few good ones at the end. Good. So let's dig into today's menu, where we will be serving you a delicious 3-course Scope 3 dinner, where we will be starting with a starter to understand the Scope 3 emissions. For main course, we will dig into Scope 3 emissions, the challenges, the solutions. And for dessert, we will talk about actionable steps to actually reducing your emissions. So that's on today's menu. Firstly, I just want to take one step back to actually look at the full picture, where 34% of the global greenhouse gas emissions actually comes from the food sectors. And that's why food businesses are such a crucial role to actually fight the climate change. And what can the food businesses do? The first step is actually to start measuring the emissions. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol have developed this standard for businesses, how to measure emissions from your operations, and divided the emissions into 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3, where up to 95% of the emissions from food businesses actually come from Scope 3 emissions. And that's why we're going to focus purely on that today. So it's time for the starter, where we will start to understand the Scope 3 emissions, assessing why this is so critical for your business from an environmental, commercial, and regulatory point of view. So, Joya, I have my first question for you. I know that indirect emissions occur in the supply chain of the company, and that there are 15 categories within Scope 3. So really my question is, why do we only talk about one of the categories within Scope 3, and under what category does food fall under?
Very good question, Rebecca. Thank you. So food procurements, food and beverage procurements fall under the Scope 3 Category 1, which is called Purchase Goods and Services. And for food and beverage businesses, usually the emissions coming from this category account for more than 70%. And that's, and moreover, the RAP has recommended that the categories that encompass at least 67% of total Scope 3 emissions must be reported upon. So we just said that usually this Scope 3 Category 1 accounts for more than 70%, and we are mandated to report in categories that were at least they impact 67% within the whole Scope 3. So that's why the Scope 3 Category 1 is so important in our Scope 3 assessment.
So when I'm talking to my colleagues and peers in the industry, and we say Scope 3 emissions, we are actually then referring to Scope 3 category 1, but am I lazy to say Scope 3 emission, or what is actually the correct one?
So I would say from a scientific point of view, maybe there is a little bit of laziness there, because as we've seen, we should anyway report on the 15 categories, or at least make sure we undergo a screening process to verify that we can neglect some of the categories, but when it is not possible to neglect them because, for example, they account for more than 67%, or anyways they have a considerable impact in the overall Scope 3 share of emissions, we should include them. Nevertheless, I understand that we want to be fast, we want to be, on point, direct, and so I would say that at least within the food and beverage sector, I could accept to name Scope 3 category 1 just Scope 3, because this is where most of our focus will need to be put.
Okay, all clear. So my second question for you, Joya, why is it so important from a business point of view to actually address the Scope 3 emissions?
It is important for several factors. Now we will see some of them. I will also use some acronyms, but don't worry about that. Let's try to stick with me. So first of all, I would say it is important because there are existing regulations such as the CSRD in the EU or the CSRD in the UK that mandate companies, large companies, for now large listed companies, to report on their emissions. But we also see a trend in other countries, for example, Australia, a little bit the US, where these conversations are ongoing of eventually adding mandatory reporting. Moreover, even if you don't fall within these regulations, your investors might demand for it, because we notice that investors are increasing demanding not only financial reporting, but also sustainability reporting. And let's pretend that nor the investors, nor the regulations apply to you. You might want to increase your brand reputation, your brand accountability, and credibility. And for that, there are voluntary frameworks that companies can follow to report emissions. For example, GRI, of which Klimato is a licensed software, but also CDP and other frameworks. And let's say after you have calculated your emissions and reported them, you might also, hopefully, want to start a journey of reducing emissions, right? But in order to reduce them, you need to focus on what is important. And only by measuring them, you can then make informed decisions and act where it is necessary to act. Once you have decided to reduce your emissions, you might want to set targets. For example, one of the most famous framework is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And in order to track your progress over time and to see how you're doing, you need to firstly calculate your baseline, but then you have to keep calculating and reporting to make sure that you are on track. And to finalize why it is important for food and beverage businesses to start measuring their Scope 3 emissions, sooner or later, the company will fall within the regulation, or consumers will demand that. And if you start now, you might save money on the long run, because you can either be fined if you don't comply with the regulations, or you might have to rush into doing these studies, these assessments, which lead to paying premium prices. So we recommend spreading it through multiple years.
Nice. Thank you for that explanation, Joya. So moving into the main course, Now we know that obviously it's very important from a business point of view to start measuring your Scope 3 emissions. But my question is really, how does this actually work in practice? What are the challenges? What are the solutions?
I'm going to start with the challenges. We have several challenges. One of the first one I would like to mention is that Scope 3 is a relatively new practice. As of now, companies were mandated, or anyways, they were aware of reporting on Scope 1 and 2, but Scope 3 was a bit forgotten, and this leads to lack of knowledge and skills. Moreover, you've said before that Scope 3 are indirect emissions from the value chain of a company. And we know that supply chains are very complex, and especially within the food and beverage businesses, sometimes they are not traceable. And this adds complexity to the task. There might also be challenges with data availability, and this is true both from the company point of view. So companies might struggle finding their data, their procurement data, but also there might be challenges in finding emission factors, so carbon footprint values to assign to these food and beverage procurements. And then companies need to really pay attention and balance completeness of the assessment versus costs. What does it mean? It means that because of this lack of data, this data availability issue, companies might not have all their procurement, so they might not reach at first a complete assessment. And of course, this increases the costs. So we need to make good decision. When is it time to stop? When is it time to decide, okay, now I'm happy with all the data I've gathered, I'm gonna do the first assessment, and then I do this iterative process to make it more and more complete over time. And also, I would say another issue could be that let's pretend the company has all their procurement data. They also have emission factors. How are you going to match them in a way that is efficient and effective with reduced human errors? This is also another challenge. So again, we go back to what we said before. It is a process that requires some time, so we need to give to the process time in order to find solutions to these challenges.
Right. So this is obviously the challenges. To the fun part, what are the solutions?
Yeah, very good point now here, because there are solutions. So it's not only time, of course, that can help, but also what we need to do, or anyways, any food and beverage company can do. And here I'm talking about restaurants, food services, but also food manufacturers. So in general, within the food and beverage sector, what needs to be done is to have food and beverage procurements. And what we recommend is to have them volume-based. What does weight-based? What it means that we recommend having the tons or the kilos of beef, of meat, of chicken, of any food and beverage that has been procured through the year, the month, and so on. And luckily for us, there are procurement systems that already help collecting all this data, and probably some of you are already using some of them. But otherwise, we highly recommend start requesting to your suppliers that these data are provided once you purchase the food and beverages. And going back also to one of the challenges, we were saying that completeness could be an issue. So we recommend to, for the first time at least, to aim for at least 80% of completeness of the assessment, so to have at least 80% of their procurements at first. But of course, you need to make sure that the high impacting food and beverage items are included in this assessment. So you can at first discard, pass me the term, some low impacting items while focusing on the high impacting ones, and then over time having a full complete assessment. Another recommendation that I would like to give is don't worry about emission factors. And why? Because there are companies such as Klimato that can provide this piece of information. So perhaps you can remove this burden from you and focus on collecting your activity data, your food and beverage procurements. And then softwares, once again, like Klimato, for example, use trained machine learning models to automatically match the activity data that you have to the emission factors. And this would solve the challenge of matching the data.
Right, thank you, Joya. So one of the most common questions I get when speaking to my customers are, is the data accurate enough? Could you maybe explain more about this, like the secondary data, the primary data, etc.?
Yes, so we've talked about a lot. About completeness. So the first step is for the company to make sure that all the food and beverage procurements are there. But then we need to also focus on gathering primary data when it comes to emission factors, because we have reached completeness of activity data. So we have all our food and beverage items we have purchased. We use emission factors, which are average values, which are so not for the specific product you are purchasing. They are for an average similar product. But then if you want to make this assessment accurate, you need to have the product carbon footprint of the actual product that you purchase. And in order to do that, you should engage with your suppliers. And what you should do, again, you should request for this product carbon footprint, and you might find out that many of your suppliers already have done this type of calculations, while some others might need help from companies to actually calculate this product carbon footprint. And you might wonder, how can I convince my suppliers to start these product carbon footprint calculations? And here I have another good news, because there are also benefits for the supplier, so we can actually convince them. And which are these benefits? So first of all, the supplier as well can actually have an overview of their emission hotspots, so they can also understand where most of the emissions come from and where they should focus if they want to start reducing their emissions. And most of the time we see that to reduce emissions, we need to enhance efficiency. And enhancing efficiency can also mean reducing costs. And also for the supplier itself, doing a product carbon footprint can boost brand reputation and accountability. And finally, more and more consumers, but also B2Bs, are asking for product carbon footprints or a full scope 1, 2, 3 assessment. And if a supplier already started this engagement, this data collection process, it will be easier then to obtain also the full picture of their company as well.
Yes, so really a win-win both for like food producer, but also the food business. Yeah, and also to add to that, what I hear also speaking to my like food producer customer is that it's starting to be acquired in tender applications and so on. So really a relevant topic at the moment. But now it's starting to be time for some dessert, and we have a food for thought for you. So in order to reduce emissions from food procurement, there are different strategies that you can incorporate in your business, such as changing your recipes if you're a food business, or product formulations if you're a food manufacturer. And Joya, I know that you were cooking some nice food with your Italian grandmother the other day, and actually have a really good example of what this could look like in practice and also on a higher volume. Would you mind telling us?
Yes, let's. So as you said, so we've learned why it is important to report and to assess and report Scope 3 emissions. That Scope 3 emissions within the food and beverage sector mainly come from this Scope 3 category 1, so food and beverage procurements. And we said that eventually we want to reduce these emissions, right, coming from our procurement. And what we can do, one of the strategies is recipe engineering, or let's say product formulation also engineering. And as you said, I'm going to take an example from my grandma. This is a chocolate fondant, or in Italian, cioccolato dal cuore morbido. And we're going to see that the carbon footprint per portion of a high impact chocolate fondant are 0.57 kilos of CO2, while a low impact one reach 0.29 kilos of CO2 per portion. And what did I do here to make it lower in emissions? So I simply replaced regular butter with margarine or plant-based butter. I replaced milk with oat milk. However, I kept the eggs. Firstly, because my grandma doesn't know how to replace them, but also maybe in my restaurant, my chefs don't know how to replace eggs, or in my product formulation, I don't want to find a solution, or I cannot find a solution for the eggs. It's fine, I'm gonna keep them, but I still made some changes in my recipe. And you see here, I've reduced the emissions of 0.30 approximately kilos of CO2 per portion. And 0.3 equals to the emissions of 1 kilo of potato. So it doesn't look huge, right? However, if we move to another scale, let's pretend that we have sold 1,500 portions of this chocolate fondant. I see that by making this engineering within the recipe, I can save emissions, and actually the highest emitting product will have 50% more emissions than the lower one. And I'm saving the emissions that I would have if I would drive from Paris to Lisbon on an average customer car. So here you see that the scale is already changing. So imagine this simple example applied to your procurement, you can really make the difference and reach your sustainability target.
Now, it's a really powerful example. Did your grandma also understand this?
I hope so.
Okay, nice. So we're actually starting to come to the end of this webinar, and I want to summarize this with 3 kind of key takeaways. The first one being that food businesses are really part of the solution to actually fight climate change. And the first thing they should be doing is to actually start measuring the Scope 3 emissions. When you've done that, the first kind of measuring part, you can start to advance and actually go into more details, such as engaging with your suppliers. I also want to mention that everything that me and Joya have been discussing today is also something that we are offering at Klimato, or could offer support with. So if you have any follow-up questions, you can also reach out to us after the webinar. But first, let's actually dig into a few questions that have been asked during the webinar. I have seen that a lot of things have been popping in, so let me go and see if we can find some good relevant one. Okay, this one. How can we get suppliers to share accurate emissions data? Sorry, it's just so many questions popping in and out. Joya, would you mind responding to that one?
Yes. So I would say that how can we get suppliers to share accurate emission data? I would say that we are not the environmental police, so we need to trust, of course, that our suppliers will provide accurate data. But of course, it is also in the interest of the supplier to provide accurate data. As we said before, they might be required by the law as well, because they also need to report on their emissions, or they want to increase their credibility, their accountability, and hopefully they also want to reduce their emissions. And the only way to be compliant, to increase their brand reputation and to reduce emissions is to actually do this job perfectly, and they need to invest sometimes in gathering accurate emission factors, data.
Good question. We also got another question here regarding measuring Scope 3 data. How often would you recommend to measure Scope 3 data?
That's another very good question. So I would say for reporting purposes, for the CSRD, for example, this needs to be done once a year. However, as we said, it is an iterative process. So it is better to spread the burden through the year. Plus, especially if you are in a reduction journey, you want to reduce your emissions and you probably have set targets, you might want to check that what you're doing is the best solution, right? That you're actually achieving your targets. And therefore, I would recommend actually doing the reports more often than once a year. I don't know, you, Rebecca, have some insights from our customers.
Yes. So most of our customers are doing it on a monthly basis. Just as you said, Joya, to actually see if you kind of are in track with your goals and targets. Obviously, it's more than fine to do it like quarterly and so on, but that is always what we start actually recommend when onboarding our customers. Yes. So I got another question here. What's the easiest way for food businesses to start measuring Scope 3 emissions? Maybe this also falls under what you described before, Joya, with the solutions, that the easiest way is, right, to actually partner up with a company such as Klimato that have the emissions data to efficiently match the emissions data with your procurements, right?
Yes, exactly. I would say, engage with supplier, engage with your procurement systems, and then upload everything in a software that can keep track of your procurement and matching them to the emission factors.
Yes, and with that being said, we also have like integrations with different procurement systems to actually do that work kind of efficiently. Okay, I think we do like one last question. It's soon kind of 4:30. So, Joya, are there any penalties for not measuring Scope 3 data?
Yes, so actually, for example, let's pretend the CSRD, you need to report on the full scope. So full scope 1, 2, and 3. And not at the beginning, but then it is auditable, like it requires audit, the CSRD, and if you don't have an accurate reporting system, there could be penalties. So yes, it needs to be done.
Okay, I think that's a good end to this webinar. And we thank everyone that have listened in. This is the first webinar of a full series of webinars. So we really do this with ambition to educate while also inspiring your business to actually reduce emissions. And we will follow up after this webinar also with different links to this recording, etc. And just feel free to follow up with any questions we might not have time to respond today. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye bye, everyone.